Most people begin their associations of the LGBT community only as far back as 50 to 60 years ago, but in actuality, queer individuals have existed before the 20th century. Shocker. However, the documentation and preservation of these kinds of records are scarce, and finding primary sources was incredibly difficult. Even legitimate secondary sources regarding my subject matter were far fewer to be found than, say, that of, well, any part of American history involving straight, white, old men. I wanted to delve into a subject that is not widely talked about, nor as respected, hence why it was so difficult to find sources. In doing this, I wanted to allow others and myself to learn more about new perspectives and shine light on individuals that tend to get lost in the narrative of early American history. So in saying that, let's explore how queer individuals exert themselves and their identities in early American history. So the first individual that I want to talk about is the public universal friend, also known as Jemima Wilkinson. She was born in Rhode Island in 1752 and brought up by a Quaker family. Backstory to Rhode Island, this is where religious freedom was allowed, so there was definitely a lot of spiritual experimentation and diversity. Jemima had become really ill, actually, like on the verge of death, causing her to go into a coma. When she woke up from this coma, Jemima Wilkinson had exclaimed that Wilkinson had died and that she had been resurrected as a genderless spirit sent by God. So in other words, Jemima's body was a vessel in which this spirit would live through. So she was now a they, and taking on this new identity, this spirit renamed themselves to be the public universal friend, or the friend. And so this was all about kind of spreading new religious awakenings. And so she began preaching in the New England area and developed a relatively large following, which was interesting because preaching was itself a masculine behavior. And they're all about spreading the message of spiritual healing, repenting sins, living a righteous lifestyle, and they also swore themselves to celibacy, which is interesting because it kind of brings to light how sexuality doesn't necessarily dictate gender, and it also targets the subject of gender because celibacy was an act of denying that female gender norm. And then with the identity of what the friend looked like, you can tell kind of in the picture, hair up like a man, but ringlets like a woman, the body of a woman, but dress of a clergyman. They wore women's shoes, but would not cover hair like traditional women. And then repeatedly would try to be referred to by the public universal friend by those who rejected them. And interestingly enough, people were not necessarily upset at the friend for choosing their expression. People were naturally aggravated, but rather a lot of people were upset because they thought that the friend was a fraud and just mental. And so they were definitely committed to this identity. And the significance of that is that by straying from traditional norms through identification, clothes, and religious action, the friend sheds light on those who identify as genderless in a new perspective. Even though the friend developed out of this call to religious duty, the choice to fully transform and commit to a new identity is still a form of expression and performance. Similar even to those who identify as nonconforming today, the focus is less on the principles of gender and more so on the act of living. So the next individual I want to focus on is Thomasine Hall. Thomasine was born originally in England in 1603 as female, who grew up to work in sewing and needlework, so a traditional female role. However, when North American expansion gave way to new opportunities, Thomasine developed into Thomas by cutting their hair and changing into male attire. This is when Thomasine would begin to shift to he/him pronouns, mainly for an economical motivation, because being Thomas meant he could serve in the military or work on tobacco plants. And so after, he did his service, Thomas then transitioned back to Thomasine again by working as a female servant to the Plymouth colony. However, this transition did not go unnoticed in the village. Rumors began to spread about their gender, especially in light of the reported sexual encounters they've had with both men and women. So this definitely became polarizing. Hall ended up getting detained by local authorities and was forcibly examined by both a group of men and women to determine what exactly Hall's gender was. In this examination, it came out inconclusive, so then it got sent down to the regional court in Jamestown to decide what should happen to him. And though these groups tried to categorize Hall, even Hall admitted to the court that they saw themselves as both, but he had no use of the male parts. And that kind of hints at the fact that Hall may have been intersex, which just means that at birth, the anatomy of their body is a combination of male and female characteristics, which explains why it came out inconclusive. The court then ordered Hall to wear clothing of both a male and female simultaneously in order for people in the town to be able to identify their dual gender status. This is significant because it gives an opposite perspective in comparison to the public universal friend who identified as neither genders instead of both. And it also gives representation to the existence of individuals like Hall who may have identified as gender fluid or bisexual. But it also allows us to shine light on the victimization of these individuals to need to be categorized. Rather than Hall being able to assert their own identity, the public made it an issue of their own and forcibly wanted to categorize them. This just also goes to show how strong gender roles were held onto, and it almost was needed in order to be civically obedient. So the next study I want to focus on is actually kind of an interesting one. The other examples I provided thus far have focused on retelling the often lost narrative of queer individuals, but for this next study, I rely more on discussion than storytelling because from this course, we are already familiar with these individuals. This in mind, I wanted to focus attention on the relationship between Hamilton and Laurens. Now, I am not attempting to claim any label of sexuality for either individual. More so, I'm critiquing historians' lack of response and serious consideration over the suggestive dialogue between Hamilton and Laurens. So in a series of letters between the two, they discuss back and forth political matters, usually. Nothing too juicy, right? However, some letters clearly show some level of closeness that was not common amongst male friends. Taking a closer look at a letter from Hamilton to Laurens, he writes, "Cold in my professions, warm in my friendship, I wish, my dear Laurens, it might be in my power, by action rather than words, to convince you that I love you. I shall only tell you that till you bade us adieu, I hardly knew the value you taught my heart to set upon you. Indeed, my heart, it was not well done. You know the opinion I entertain of mankind, and how much it is my desire to preserve myself free from particular attachments, and to keep my happiness independent on the caprice of others. You should not have taken advantage of my sensibility to steal into my affections without my consent. But as you have done it, and as we are generally indulgent to those we love, I shall not scruple to pardon the fraud you have committed, on condition that for my sake, if not for your own, you will always continue to merit the partiality which you have so artfully instilled into me." And definitely this whole paragraph reads as very tenderly, as though it is between lovers rather than leaders or even friends. Also in the letters, it's common that they sign off with yours most sincerely, adieu, be happy, let friendship between us be more than a name. And even Laurens entertains this sometimes by saying, "My dear Hamilton," or "Adieu again, yours ever." And with that in mind, even though there is no mention of serious suggestion of these men interacting more closely with one another, it cannot go unnoticed that the two, more so Hamilton, showed an affection that can question the entirety of their sexuality and expression of that sexuality. When searching to find commentary, I could find no legitimate sources to expand on this idea. Rather, I found extensive summaries of the legacy that Hamilton left behind for our country. And while that's great in that regard, no reaction becomes a reaction. And what I mean by that is if Hamilton was seriously presumed to be gay by historians, the image, for many unfortunately, would alter our perception of one of the founding fathers to this country, someone who is economically and socially high-ranking and has been monumentalized since the Revolution. And that really is significant because though Hamilton did not clearly assert a sexual identity, rather he asserted his love and fondness for Laurens, not only does this open a conversation between our perception of historic figures in the matter of their personal sexuality, but it also allows us to qualify the background and character of big-name American leaders. So to end on that note, I just want to say thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you got something out of it. Thanks so much.